A thin mist hangs low over a prehistoric valley, settling between fractured ridges of stone and wide stretches of untamed forest. The world is quiet in a way that feels permanent, as if silence itself has become part of the landscape. Herds move slowly across distant plains, unaware of anything watching them beyond the usual predators that have always ruled this place. Nothing in the rhythm of life here suggests disruption. Nothing hints that the balance is about to change in a way the planet has never seen before. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. At this point in time, humans exist only as one thread in a far larger ecological fabric. Small bands move through forests and grasslands, following seasonal cycles, relying on instinct refined through generations. Their presence is almost invisible in the scale of the planet. Compared to the great predators that dominate these ecosystems, they are fragile, vulnerable, and often forced to retreat rather than confront. Survival depends on observation, memory, and the ability to read subtle changes in environment that most other species ignore. Yet beneath this apparent insignificance, something unusual is beginning to form. It is not a physical transformation that can be seen directly in bones or landscapes. It is a shift in how the mind processes reality. Early human cognition is becoming increasingly flexible, capable of connecting patterns that do not exist side by side in nature. A broken branch becomes a message. A distant migration becomes a prediction. A change in wind direction becomes a map of future movement. This is not instinct in the traditional sense. It is something more layered, something that allows cause and effect to be stretched across time. In this quiet world, there are no monuments, no cities, no evidence of human dominance, but there is awareness. And awareness, unlike physical strength, does not remain static. It accumulates. The landscapes themselves appear indifferent. Rivers carve through ancient rock formations that have not changed in thousands of years. Seasonal fires sweep across dry grasslands, resetting ecological cycles without preference or direction. Ice advances and retreats across distant northern regions, shaping coastlines in slow, geological breaths. Everything moves according to systems far larger than any individual species. Humans, in this setting, are simply participants. But participation is beginning to shift into influence, even if only in the smallest increments. Groups that once relied solely on scavenging begin to observe patterns in animal behavior with increasing precision. Certain migration routes become predictable. Certain plants are associated with seasonal abundance or scarcity. These observations accumulate across generations, passed down not as formal knowledge, but as lived memory. Over time, memory becomes structure. Structure becomes strategy. What survives in the archaeological record from this period is sparse. A few stone tools, some modified bones, traces of fire-blackened soil. Yet these fragments suggest something important. Humans are no longer merely reacting to the environment. They are beginning to anticipate it. Across vast regions, similar changes occur independently. There is no single origin point, no central catalyst. Instead, cognition itself appears to be reaching a threshold across multiple populations. This convergence is one of the most debated aspects among scholars. Some argue it is driven by environmental pressure. Others suggest gradual neurological evolution. The evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern is consistent wherever humans exist. Adaptability increases. In the forests, survival still demands caution. Large predators continue to shape movement patterns. Hyenas, big cats, and other apex hunters remain dominant forces. Yet humans begin to occupy a different ecological niche, one defined not by strength, but by coordination. Even in small groups, cooperation becomes more sophisticated. Signals, gestures, and shared understanding allow for coordinated responses that no single individual could achieve alone. At first, these changes do not alter the broader ecosystem. The world continues as it always has. But beneath this surface stability, pressure is slowly accumulating, not visible in any single moment, but embedded in countless small decisions repeated over generations. The silent dawn of human power is not marked by conquest or sudden expansion. It is defined by accumulation, a gradual layering of perception, memory, and shared intention. Each generation inherits not only tools and techniques, but increasingly complex ways of interpreting reality itself. There are places where early humans leave almost no trace at all, moving through landscapes so lightly that even their presence fades quickly after they pass. Yet even in these minimal imprints, there is something new, the beginning of deliberate alteration. Branches are cut not just for immediate use, but to shape access paths. Stones are positioned not randomly, but with intent that extends beyond the present moment. These are small gestures, almost indistinguishable from natural disturbance. Yet they carry a different quality. They are choices that anticipate future outcomes. Elsewhere, entire herds shift their migration routes in response to repeated human presence, not because humans dominate them directly, but because patterns of pressure begin to emerge. Fire, sound, and coordinated movement gradually influence animal behavior. Ecosystems adapt, but they do so in response to a new kind of participant, one that does not simply occupy space, but learns how to reshape it indirectly. Still, there is no awareness among humans themselves that anything extraordinary is happening. From their perspective, this is simply survival. Adaptation is not recognized as transformation. It is necessity. And yet, when viewed across the span of deep time, this period represents the earliest stage of a turning point that will eventually redefine the planet's entire ecological structure. It is the moment before acceleration, before expansion, before dominance becomes visible. The Earth remains vast, indifferent, and older than anything living upon it. But within one species, a new capability is quietly taking form. Not strength in the traditional sense, not speed or size. Something far more destabilizing to the natural order, the ability to imagine outcomes that do not yet exist, and to act toward them with persistence. This is the beginning of a shift that cannot be reversed once fully established. At this stage, it is still fragile, still localized, still dependent on environmental support, but the foundation has been laid, and from here, every change will begin to compound. The world before human dominance stretches across immense ecological systems that operate with a kind of quiet confidence. Forests expand and retreat according to climate cycles that have repeated for thousands of years. Rivers carve predictable paths through ancient rock, carrying sediment that will one day become entire layers of geological history. Animal populations rise and fall, but always within limits enforced by predation, disease, and seasonal scarcity. Nothing in this system suggests instability. It is self-correcting, balanced, and indifferent to individual life. In this environment, humans are still peripheral. Their presence is scattered across continents, rarely concentrated enough to leave lasting marks on the land. Even where they are present, their impact blends into natural noise. A burned patch of grassland could just as easily be caused by lightning as by human fire. A cluster of broken bones might be the result of scavenging predators, rather than coordinated human activity. The planet, from a distance, would appear unchanged. Yet beneath this apparent stability, a subtle imbalance is forming, not in the ecosystems themselves, but in the way one species begins to interact with them. Humans are not stronger than the great predators of this era. They're not faster than most prey animals, nor are they equipped with natural defenses that guarantee survival. What distinguishes them is not their place in the hierarchy, but their relationship to time. Most species live within immediate constraints: hunger, danger, reproduction. Their decisions are shaped by present conditions. Humans, however, begin to operate with an expanding sense of anticipation. This does not emerge suddenly, but accumulates gradually through observation and memory. A migration route is not just a pattern, it becomes a cycle. A fruiting season is not just an event, it becomes a future expectation. A predator encounter is not just survival, it becomes a lesson encoded into group behavior. Across different regions of the world, similar cognitive structures begin to appear independently. This is one of the more striking patterns in prehistory. There is no single point of origin for this shift. Instead, it arises wherever human groups persist long enough under environmental pressure. Scholars still debate whether this is driven primarily by biological evolution or by cultural transmission. But the result is consistent: humans begin to build internal models of the world. These models are not written or formalized. They exist in memory, gesture, repetition, and shared experience. Over time, they become more reliable than instinct alone. A group that remembers where water sources reappear after dry seasons has an advantage over one that does not. A group that can predict the movement of herds across valleys gains access to resources before others arrive. Small advantages accumulate, and accumulation becomes survival. The planet itself remains unchanged in its structure, but the way humans move through it begins to shift. Pathways emerge where repeated travel creates invisible corridors of familiarity. Campsites return to the same locations, not by design, but by habit reinforced through success. Fire is used more frequently, not just for warmth, but for protection, cooking, and environmental control. Each use leaves a subtle imprint, a trace of human preference layered onto natural systems. In some regions, particularly where climate conditions fluctuate more dramatically, these adaptations become more pronounced. Ice ages and interglacial periods force constant relocation. Human groups that can track environmental change across generations begin to outcompete those that cannot. Survival is no longer just about strength or speed, but about continuity of knowledge. One of the most important developments during this period is the increasing sophistication of tool use. Early tools are simple extensions of the hand-sharpened stones, carved bones, wooden implements. But even these basic instruments begin to reflect foresight. A stone is not just selected for immediate use, it is shaped in anticipation of future tasks. This marks a subtle but critical shift. Objects begin to carry intention beyond the moment of creation. Archaeological evidence from this era is fragmentary, yet consistent across multiple continents. Tool assemblages show gradual refinement rather than sudden invention. This suggests that innovation is not a singular event but a continuous process, driven by incremental improvements passed through generations. Each generation does not start from zero. It builds upon accumulated experience. At the same time, humans begin to alter their environment in ways that are no longer purely incidental. Controlled fire becomes more widespread, and with it comes the ability to reshape landscapes. Burning vegetation clears land for movement, drives prey animals into predictable patterns, and reduces the risk of hidden predators. Over time, these effects begin to compound. Forest edges shift. Grasslands expand in areas where fire is frequently used. Ecosystems respond, but not always in ways that restore previous balance. It is important to understand that these changes are not intentional in a modern sense. There is no overarching plan to transform the environment. Instead, each action is local, immediate, and practical. But when repeated across generations and regions, local actions begin to produce global effects. In some fossil records, shifts in animal distribution appear to correlate loosely with the expansion of human populations. Large herbivores begin to show altered migration routes. Predator-prey dynamics shift in subtle ways. These changes are not uniform, and they are not always directly attributable to human activity alone. Climate variability also plays a significant role, but the overlap is difficult to ignore. What is becoming clear is that humans are no longer just another species within ecological systems. They are becoming a factor that influences system behavior, not yet dominant, not yet overwhelming, but increasingly present in ways that alter outcomes. Despite this, the world still appears stable on the surface. No sudden collapse occurs, no visible rupture divides past from future. Instead, change spreads like sediment through water, slow, continuous, and often unnoticed until it accumulates into something unmistakable. And within this slow accumulation, the foundation of something unprecedented continues to form. There is a point in deep prehistory where change does not announce itself with any visible rupture, yet everything begins to behave differently when viewed across generations. In the quiet rhythm of survival, something subtle is unfolding inside the human mind. Not a sudden leap, not a moment of invention, but a slow reconfiguration of how experience is processed, stored, and reused. Across scattered populations, the cognitive landscape of early humans begins to expand beyond immediate perception. The world is no longer only what is seen, heard, and felt in the present moment. It becomes something that can be reconstructed internally, even in the absence of direct evidence. A dried riverbed is no longer just a place without water. It becomes a memory of where water once was, and a prediction of where it may return. This shift is difficult to detect in physical remains, yet its consequences begin to accumulate in behavior. Early human groups start returning to locations not because they are currently favorable, but because they were previously favorable under similar conditions. This introduces a new layer of decision-making that no longer depends solely on instinct or immediate stimulus. It depends on recall. Memory, in this sense, is not yet structured as language or formal record. It exists as distributed knowledge across individuals, reinforced through repetition and social observation. A successful hunt is remembered not as an abstract event, but as a sequence of actions tied to a place, a season, and a set of environmental cues. Over time, these sequences become reusable patterns. The most significant change occurring during this period is not technological at first, but cognitive integration. Humans begin to connect separated events into continuous chains of cause and effect. Smoke is no longer just a result of fire. It becomes a signal that fire exists beyond sight. Tracks in soil are no longer just marks. They become evidence of movement that continues beyond the visible horizon. This ability to infer unseen processes fundamentally alters how humans interact with their environment. It allows anticipation, and anticipation, once established, changes survival from reaction into planning, even if that planning is rudimentary and short-lived. Tool use begins to reflect this change in cognition. Stones are selected not only for immediate effectiveness but for their potential future use. A sharpened edge is preserved rather than discarded after a single task. Materials begin to be stored, transported, and reused in ways that suggest continuity of purpose. The object itself becomes part of a longer sequence of action. In parallel, social structures begin to adapt to this growing complexity. Small groups remain the primary unit of survival, but coordination within those groups becomes more sophisticated. Individuals begin to specialize informally based on skill or experience. Some become more effective at tracking animals, others at processing materials, others at navigating terrain. These roles are not fixed, but they represent early forms of functional differentiation. This is not hierarchy in the modern sense, but it is the beginning of organized cooperation that extends beyond immediate necessity. The group begins to behave less like a collection of individuals and more like a single adaptive system. Decisions are no longer purely individual reactions. They are increasingly shaped by shared memory and collective expectation. At the same time, environmental pressures continue to act as the primary force shaping survival. Climate fluctuations, seasonal instability, and unpredictable resource distribution force constant adjustment. In regions where conditions shift rapidly, cognitive flexibility becomes a decisive advantage. Groups that can adapt their internal models of the world survive longer periods of scarcity and uncertainty. Archaeological evidence from this stage remains limited, but what exists suggests increasing refinement in both tools and behavior. Stone technologies show more consistent shaping patterns, where analysis indicates repeated use and maintenance. These are not isolated innovations, but signs of cumulative improvement passed across generations. One of the most important yet often overlooked developments during this period is the increasing awareness of spatial relationships. Humans begin to mentally map their surroundings in a more structured way. Not in abstract diagrams, but in lived experience that connects landmarks, resources, and hazards across distance. Movement through terrain becomes less random and more guided by internal representation. This internal mapping is crucial because it allows humans to operate beyond immediate sensory range. A group can plan movement toward a water source that is not currently visible. They can avoid areas known to contain danger even when that danger is not present at the moment. This expands the effective range of survival. In ecological terms, this represents a subtle but important shift. Humans begin to reduce randomness in their interactions with the environment. Where once movement was largely reactive, it now begins to show structure. Predictability increases, even if only slightly. Other species continue to operate within their established ecological roles. Large predators still dominate through physical capability. Herbivores still migrate according to seasonal cycles. But humans begin to occupy a different kind of space within this system. They're no longer fully bound to immediate ecological cues. They begin to operate on remembered patterns of the landscape itself. This is where the cognitive leap becomes most visible in its consequences, not in sudden technological breakthroughs, but in the gradual expansion of control over time and space. The ability to remember past conditions and anticipate future ones creates a feedback loop. Successful predictions reinforce the behaviors that produced them, making them more likely to be repeated and refined. Across continents, similar patterns emerge independently. This convergence suggests that the underlying conditions for cognitive expansion are widespread. It is not a localized phenomenon. It is a species-wide transition occurring at different rates depending on environment and pressure. Still, from the perspective of the wider world, nothing appears dramatically altered. There are no sudden ecological collapses, no visible signs of disruption at global scale. The planet continues its long cycles of change with apparent indifference. Yet within this stability, a new form of intelligence is beginning to take shape, one that does not merely exist within nature, but increasingly learns how to interpret it, predict it, and eventually influence it in subtle ways. And once a species begins to consistently act on what is not yet present, the structure of its relationship with the world changes permanently. Stone lies at the centre of this transformation, not because it is remarkable in itself, but because it becomes the first material that humans learn to systematically reshape with intent. In riverbeds, on open plains, and at the edges of ancient forests, stones are fractured, tested, and selected with increasing awareness of their properties. Some break cleanly, others resist, some produce sharp edges, others crumble over generations. This trial becomes knowledge, and knowledge becomes technique. At first, these tools are simple extensions of the hand, a sharp edge for cutting plant fibers, a pointed fragment for breaking bone or wood, a heavy stone for crushing. But even in their simplicity, they represent something new in the natural world, objects that are not merely found, but produced according to a mental image of a future task. This shift is subtle but profound. In most species, tools, if they exist at all, are opportunistic. A stick is used if it happens to be present. A stone is used if it already fits a need. Among early humans, selection begins to replace coincidence. The environment is no longer just a source of objects. It becomes a field of raw material. What emerges from this is a growing separation between function and form. A stone is no longer just what it is, but what it can become. This distinction exists first in the mind before it exists in reality, and once that distinction is stable, technological development becomes cumulative. Across different regions, similar patterns of tool refinement appear independently. The shapes vary depending on available materials and local needs, but the underlying logic remains consistent. Edges become sharper, flaking becomes more controlled, and waste is reduced as efficiency increases. These are not dramatic innovations, but incremental improvements that accumulate across thousands of generations. Archaeological layers from this period reveal something important: repetition. The same types of tools appear across long stretches of time with gradual variation. This suggests not sudden bursts of invention, but continuous refinement embedded in daily survival. Each generation inherits not only objects, but methods of making those objects better. At the same time, human interaction with the environment becomes more deliberate. Hunting is no longer purely opportunistic. It begins to involve planning, coordination, and anticipation of animal behavior. Tool use enhances this shift. Sharpened stones extend reach. Spears extend distance. Scraping tools allow extraction of resources that would otherwise be inaccessible. These extensions of capability begin to alter ecological relationships in small but meaningful ways. Prey animals encounter pressure that is no longer purely natural. Predators face competition from a new kind of hunter, one that does not rely on claws or teeth, but on constructed advantage. Fire, increasingly controlled during this period, amplifies these changes. Not only does it provide warmth and protection, but it becomes a tool for shaping movement. Smoke can drive animals towards specific paths. Burned landscapes can temporarily reduce cover, making tracking easier. Fire also transforms food itself, increasing caloric availability and reducing risk from pathogens. This has long-term effects on health, survival, and population stability. The combination of tools and fire marks a critical threshold. Humans are no longer limited to what their bodies can directly accomplish. Their effectiveness begins to depend on externalized capability. In other words, power is no longer confined within the organism. It is distributed across objects and controlled environments. Yet this transformation remains invisible in any single moment. There is no point at which early humans recognize that they are altering ecological systems. Each action is local, practical, and immediate. A tool is made to solve a problem. Fire is used to survive cold nights or secure food. But when these actions are repeated across generations and continents, their cumulative effect begins to reshape landscapes. Forests near frequently occupied areas begin to show signs of alteration. Certain plant species become more dominant due to repeated disturbance. Animal migration patterns shift in response to persistent human presence. Some species adapt, others retreat, and some begin long-term declines in local regions. These changes are uneven and gradual, often indistinguishable from natural variability in the short term. What makes this period significant is not the scale of transformation, but the direction of it. Humans are beginning to act as a selective force within ecosystems, not through conscious intention at a global level, but through repeated localized actions that accumulate into broader ecological influence. The relationship between humans and stone tools also begins to evolve socially. Knowledge of tool production becomes increasingly valuable within groups. Individuals who are more skilled at producing effective tools gain advantages in survival and influence. This does not yet form rigid social classes, but it introduces early differentiation based on expertise. In some cases, specific techniques are refined and passed down through informal teaching. A successful method of flaking stone is observed, imitated, and improved. Over time, these methods become recognizable patterns within groups. Technology begins to carry cultural identity, even in its earliest form. Meanwhile, mobility remains a key survival strategy. Groups continue to move in response to seasonal changes, resource availability, and environmental pressures. But movement is no longer random. It is guided by accumulated knowledge of terrain, climate cycles, and ecological patterns. Landscapes become mentally organized into zones of opportunity and risk. This mental organization is one of the most important developments of the period. It allows humans to operate across larger spatial scales without losing coherence in decision-making. Even when physically distant from a location, it can still be represented internally as part of a broader system of survival strategy. Other species continue to interact with the environment directly, responding to immediate stimuli. Humans increasingly interact with representations of the environment stored in memory and shared experience. This distinction creates a widening gap in adaptive capability. Still, the world itself remains vast and resilient. Ecosystems continue to function under their own internal dynamics. No single species yet exerts global control. But within this balance, one species is beginning to build a layered relationship with reality, one that combines physical action, memory, anticipation, and modification. Stone, fire, and cognition together form the foundation of a new ecological role. Not dominance in the modern sense, but a gradual shift towards shaping the conditions of survival rather than simply enduring them. And once a species begins to consistently shape its own conditions, even in small ways, the trajectory of its future becomes fundamentally different from all others that came before it. Fire begins as a fracture in the natural order of survival, a force that belongs to the earth but slowly becomes governed by human intention. In the earliest moments of contact, it is unpredictable, dangerous, and often destructive to those who approach it. Lightning strikes ignite forests without warning. Volcanic heat reshapes landscapes, and burning grasslands spread across dry seasons with indifferent momentum. Fire is not controlled, it is endured. Yet somewhere within this volatile relationship, early humans begin to recognize that fire can be separated from its chaos, not eliminated, not fully tamed at first, but contained, carried, and eventually reproduced. The moment this transition begins, a fundamental boundary in ecological history starts to dissolve. Carrying embers from one location to another is one of the earliest signs of this shift. A flame preserved through night or transported across distance is no longer a natural event. It becomes a maintained condition. This simple act marks a transformation in how humans relate to environmental forces. What was once episodic becomes continuous. The implications unfold slowly but inevitably. Fire extends daylight into darkness, reshaping daily rhythms. It creates safety in environments where predators rely on night advantage. It alters the very structure of social interaction, as groups gather around controlled heat sources, extending communication and cooperation beyond daylight constraints. More significantly, fire transforms food itself. Cooking is not merely a convenience, it is a biochemical change that increases energy extraction from resources. Tough plant fibers become digestible, raw proteins become safer to consume. In nutritional terms, this represents a hidden expansion of available energy. Over time, this contributes to changes in physiology, behavior, and population stability. Archaeological traces of controlled fire appear unevenly across regions, but where they do appear consistently, they mark a turning point in human adaptation. Burned sediments, charcoal deposits, and heat-altered stone tools indicate repeated and intentional use rather than isolated natural incidents. The pattern suggests familiarity, not accident. As fire becomes more integrated into daily survival, its influence extends beyond immediate use. Landscapes begin to respond, areas subjected to repeated burning shift in vegetation composition. Some plant species adapted to fire cycles expand, while others decline. This creates new ecological mosaics shaped indirectly by human behavior. At the same time, hunting practices begin to incorporate fire as a strategic tool. Controlled burns can drive herds towards specific terrain features, making them easier to track or capture. Smoke can disorient animals, reducing their escape efficiency. These are not large-scale strategies in the modern sense, but localized adaptations that gradually improve survival outcomes. What is important here is not just the use of fire, but its integration into planning. Fire becomes part of anticipation. It is no longer just a reaction to cold or darkness. It becomes a variable that can be deployed to influence future conditions. This marks a deeper cognitive shift. Humans are not only responding to the environment, they're beginning to introduce controlled variables into it. Even if unintentionally at first, they are modifying ecological processes to serve immediate needs. Each use of fire adds a layer of influence that accumulates over time. In regions where fire use becomes frequent, subtle but persistent changes begin to appear in animal behavior. Some species avoid previously neutral areas due to recurring burns. Others alter migration timing to reduce exposure. These adaptations are not evidence of collapse, but of pressure. The ecosystem is adjusting to a new type of disturbance, one that is repetitive, localized, and human-linked. Despite these changes, the overall system remains stable. Fire does not yet dominate landscapes on a global scale. it is still one factor among many, including climate variability, seasonal cycles, and predator dynamics. But its presence introduces a new kind of ecological force, one that originates from behavior rather than geology or climate. Human groups themselves begin to change in response to fire's possibilities. Settlement duration increases in certain favorable locations where fire can be reliably maintained. This leads to longer occupation of specific areas, which in turn increases environmental impact. Even temporary camps begin to leave more persistent traces as fire use becomes routine. Socially, fire also reinforces cohesion. Shared control of fire requires coordination. Maintaining it through night demands attention and cooperation. This strengthens group bonds and introduces early forms of collective responsibility. Fire becomes both a tool and a focal point of social structure. Over time, this shared dependency begins to influence group identity. Knowledge of fire management becomes a skill that is passed down, refined, and adapted. While still informal, this transmission represents one of the earliest forms of structured knowledge continuity beyond immediate survival. At a broader scale, the combined effects of fire, tools, and increasing cognitive complexity begin to reshape the ecological position of humans. They are no longer passive participants in environmental cycles. They are increasingly agents of modification, even if unintentionally. The planet itself does not react dramatically. There are no sudden breaks or visible global shifts. Instead, change accumulates quietly, embedded in countless localized interactions between humans and their surroundings. And within this accumulation, fire stands out as a turning point not because it is new to the Earth, but because it becomes consistently guided by intention. It bridges the gap between natural force and directed action. Once that bridge is established, even in its earliest fragile form, the path toward broader environmental transformation becomes irreversible. Across open grasslands and forest edges, movement begins to take on a different rhythm. It is no longer random dispersion in search of survival, but increasingly a coordinated response to shared knowledge. Early human groups start to move not only with the seasons, but with expectations shaped by accumulated experience. Herds are no longer just encountered, they are anticipated. Water sources are not merely discovered, they are revisited with intention. In this shifting landscape, hunting becomes one of the first arenas where cooperation reaches a level of complexity that distinguishes humans from other predators. Unlike solitary hunters that rely on speed, strength, or stealth alone, early humans begin to distribute roles within a group. Some track signs across terrain, others position themselves along probable escape routes, while others remain ready to drive or intercept prey. These divisions are not rigid, but they represent a functional coordination that significantly increases success rates. What makes this development important is not just efficiency, but synchronization. Multiple individuals begin to act as parts of a single behavioral system. This system is not biological in the strict sense, but emergent through shared understanding and repeated interaction. Communication, still nonverbal and gestural, becomes increasingly refined to support coordinated action. Evidence of these behaviors is indirect but consistent. Archaeological patterns of hunted animal remains show selective targeting of species and age groups in ways that suggest planning rather than opportunistic scavenging. Bone assemblages in certain sites indicate repeated use of specific kill locations, implying knowledge of terrain and animal movement cycles. At the same time, environmental pressure continues to shape behavior. Climate fluctuations, particularly shifts between colder and warmer periods, force both animals and humans into constant adaptation. migration routes shift, resource availability becomes less predictable, and survival increasingly depends on the ability to track environmental patterns over time. In response, human groups begin to expand their operational range. Movement across larger territories becomes more frequent, not only in reaction to scarcity, but as a proactive strategy. This expansion increases exposure to diverse environments, each with its own ecological constraints and opportunities. Over time, this contributes to the accumulation of broader environmental knowledge within groups. Cooperative hunting also has an unintended consequence. It begins to exert more consistent pressure on animal populations. Unlike solitary predation, which is limited by individual capacity, coordinated group hunting increases efficiency and success rates. This does not immediately destabilize ecosystems, but it introduces a new kind of pressure, one that is systematic rather than incidental. Some animal species begin to exhibit changes in behavior in response. Herds become more cautious, altering grazing patterns and increasing vigilance. Migration timing adjusts in subtle ways. These are early indicators of ecological adaptation to human presence, though the full impact remains diffuse and regionally variable. Within human groups, successful coordination reinforces social cohesion. Individuals who contribute effectively to group success gain status through practical recognition. This status is not yet formalized into hierarchy, but it influences access to resources and decision-making within the group. Cooperation becomes not only a survival strategy, but a basis for internal organization. Fire and tools integrate further into hunting strategies. Fire may be used to influence animal movement, while tools allow for greater range and lethality. Spears extend reach beyond immediate proximity, reducing risk during encounters with larger or more dangerous animals. Stone tools allow for more efficient processing of carcasses, increasing the usable yield from each hunt. These combined technologies create a feedback loop. More efficient hunting increases resource availability, which supports larger or more stable groups. Larger groups, in turn, enable more complex coordination and improved hunting strategies. Over time, this cycle contributes to gradual population growth in favorable regions. However, this growth is not uniform. It is constrained by environmental conditions, resource distribution, and climatic variability. Some regions support expansion, while others impose limits that force migration or adaptation. The result is a patchwork of human presence across the landscape, with varying degrees of ecological impact. One of the most important developments during this period is the increasing predictability of animal behavior from the human perspective. Through repeated observation, humans begin to recognize patterns in migration, feeding, and breeding cycles. These patterns become embedded in group memory, allowing for more precise timing of hunting activities. This predictive capability represents a significant shift in ecological interaction. Humans are no longer reacting solely to immediate stimuli. They are acting based on anticipated future states of the environment. This introduces a temporal depth to behavior that most other species do not exhibit at this scale. At the same time, the internal structure of human groups begins to reflect increasing complexity. While still relatively egalitarian, there is a growing differentiation in roles based on experience and skill. Some individuals become recognized for their ability to track, others for their knowledge of terrain, others for tool production or group coordination. These roles are flexible, but they indicate the emergence of functional specialization. This specialization enhances group efficiency, but also increases interdependence. Survival becomes less about individual capability and more about collective performance. This shift strengthens the importance of communication, memory transmission, and shared understanding. Across continents, similar patterns emerge independently. This convergence suggests that cooperative behavior and cognitive expansion are not isolated developments, but responses to shared environmental and survival pressures. Wherever humans exist under sufficient ecological challenge, cooperation becomes increasingly advantageous. Despite these changes, the broader ecological systems remain intact. Predators continue to regulate herbivore populations. Climate cycles continue to shape landscapes. Humans are still one factor among many, but their influence is becoming more structured, more consistent, and more capable of producing cumulative effects over time. What begins to emerge here is a new ecological role defined not by physical dominance alone, but by coordination, anticipation, and cumulative impact. Humans are beginning to act as a distributed system within the environment, one capable of shaping outcomes through collective behavior rather than individual force. And once survival depends on coordination at this scale, the trajectory of human development begins to diverge irreversibly from that of all other species. The landscape is still vast enough to make human presence feel insignificant from any distant perspective. Mountain ranges remain unchanged for tens of thousands of years. Rivers continue to carve their ancient paths through stone and sediment. Forests expand and contract in cycles that long predate any human memory. Yet within this immense continuity, something subtle is beginning to accumulate an imprint that is not geological in origin, but behavioral. Human groups, increasingly coordinated and mobile, begin to leave behind traces that persist longer than before. Not because each individual action is more destructive, but because actions are repeated in the same locations with growing regularity. Campsites return to familiar valleys. Hunting grounds are revisited across seasons. Water sources become shared points of convergence. Over time, these repeated interactions begin to alter the structure of the environment itself. At first, the changes are barely distinguishable from natural variation. Vegetation thins in areas of frequent occupation, but regrows in surrounding regions. Animal populations shift slightly, but remain within overall ecological balance. Yet the repetition of human activity introduces a new pattern into the system-localized pressure that does not dissipate immediately. One of the earliest visible effects of this pattern is the gradual transformation of vegetation near repeated human presence. Fire, gathering, and movement all contribute to subtle changes in plant composition. Some species tolerate disturbance and begin to expand. Others, more sensitive to repeated disruption, slowly recede. Over long periods, this leads to the formation of edge environment zones shaped not purely by climate or soil, but by repeated human interaction. These changes are not intentional in any global sense. Early humans are not managing ecosystems. They are responding to immediate needs: warmth, food, protection, mobility. But when these needs are expressed repeatedly in the same landscapes, the cumulative effect becomes structural. In parallel, animal behavior continues to adjust. Species that are frequently hunted or disturbed begin to alter their spatial habits. Some shift their grazing patterns to avoid predictable human routes. Others increase their reliance on more remote or inaccessible terrain. These adaptations are gradual and uneven, reflecting the variability of human presence across regions. What emerges is a form of ecological negotiation, although neither side is consciously aware of it. Humans adapt to animal movement patterns, while animals adapt to human pressure. The relationship is dynamic, constantly recalibrating, but increasingly influenced by human consistency rather than pure environmental randomness. Within human groups, the increasing importance of knowledge begins to reshape internal dynamics. Individuals who possess reliable information about animal behavior, terrain features, or seasonal changes gain practical influence. This influence is not formalized, but it affects decision-making and group movement. Experience becomes a form of currency, exchanged through guidance and leadership in critical situations. This is also the period where memory begins to extend beyond the lifespan of a single individual in a more structured way. Information is passed down with greater accuracy through repeated demonstration and shared practice. While still dependent on oral and observational transmission, knowledge becomes more stable across generations. This stability allows groups to return to known successful strategies rather than relying solely on immediate improvisation. Tool use continues to evolve in parallel with these cognitive and social changes. Stone tools become more standardized in certain regions, reflecting shared techniques and repeated refinement. The consistency of these tools suggests not only technical improvement, but also the emergence of shared norms in production. While there is still variation between groups, internal consistency increases within local populations. Fire, already integrated into survival practices, begins to have broader environmental consequences. Repeated burning in certain regions leads to long-term changes in landscape structure. Grasslands expand in areas where fire suppresses tree regrowth. In other regions, fire-sensitive ecosystems retreat, reshaping biodiversity patterns. These changes are uneven, but they mark the beginning of human influence as a recurring ecological force rather than a rare disturbance. Importantly, these transformations remain distributed and uncoordinated. There is no central planning or deliberate environmental management. Instead, change emerges from the aggregation of countless small decisions made across time and space. Each fire set, each hunting expedition, each tool used contributes incrementally to a larger pattern. One of the most significant developments during this period is the increasing reliability of group cooperation under pressure. In high-risk environments, coordinated behavior becomes essential. Groups that fail to act cohesively in response to danger or opportunity are less likely to survive long-term environmental fluctuations. This reinforces the value of communication, trust, and shared understanding. Over time, this leads to stronger internal cohesion within groups. While still flexible and adaptive, social bonds become more resilient. Cooperation is no longer situational. It becomes a baseline requirement for survival in many environments. This has profound implications for how humans interact with both their environment and each other. At the same time, environmental variability continues to impose constraints. Ice age cycles, droughts, and shifting ecosystems force repeated adjustments in movement and behavior. Human groups are not stable entities anchored to fixed locations. They are dynamic systems in constant motion, tracking resources across vast and changing landscapes. This mobility contributes to the spread of human presence across continents. As groups move into new regions, they encounter unfamiliar ecosystems, new species, and different environmental pressures. Each migration introduces variation into human behavior, while also increasing the overall ecological footprint of the species. Despite this expansion, humans remain one species among many. Large predators still regulate prey populations. Ecosystems still function according to long-established cycles. But within these systems, human influence is becoming more persistent and more structurally integrated. What distinguishes this period is not domination, but continuity. Human actions begin to accumulate in ways that persist across generations, gradually reshaping ecological conditions without immediate recognition of the scale involved. And within this quiet accumulation, the groundwork is being laid for a transformation that will eventually move beyond adaptation into something far more irreversible. In the long rhythm of Earth's ecological history, extinction is not unusual. Species appear, expand, contract, and disappear as climates shift and environments transform. But in this particular stretch of prehistory, something unusual begins to register in the fossil and archaeological record. The disappearance of large-bodied animals appears to accelerate in regions where humans are present. At first, the pattern is not clear enough to draw firm conclusions. Large mammals and other megafauna still thrive in many areas of the world. Their decline is uneven, scattered across continents and environments that are also undergoing climatic fluctuations. Ice sheets advance and retreat, rainfall patterns shift, and vegetation zones move across latitudes. Any of these factors alone could account for changes in animal distribution. Yet when viewed across broader timescales, a recurring association begins to emerge. Where human populations expand into new territories, large animals often decline not long after. This is not a uniform or instantaneous process. It unfolds over generations, sometimes centuries, and varies significantly depending on region and ecology. Still, the correlation is difficult to ignore. One of the key characteristics of large animals is their slow reproductive cycle. Many megafaunal species require long gestation periods and produce relatively few offspring. This makes them especially vulnerable to sustained pressure. Even if that pressure is not overwhelming in a single event, human hunting combined with habitat modification and repeated disturbance introduces exactly this kind of cumulative stress. Importantly, there is no evidence of coordinated large-scale extermination strategies during this period. Instead, hunting remains localized, opportunistic, and tied to immediate survival needs. But when small-scale pressure is repeated across wide regions and long periods, the ecological outcome begins to shift. Extinction, in this context, is not a sudden act, but an emergent process. Some archaeological sites contain concentrated remains of the large animal processing, suggesting repeated exploitation of specific species. Cut marks on bones, butchering patterns, and selective targeting of certain age groups indicate systematic use rather than random scavenging. These patterns vary by region, but they collectively point toward increasing efficiency in extracting resources from large fauna. At the same time, environmental stresses continue to operate in the background. Climate instability during glacial and interglacial cycles alters habitats dramatically. In some cases, shrinking ranges and fragmented populations make large animals more vulnerable regardless of human presence. This makes it difficult to isolate a single cause. Most scholars agree that extinction during this period is likely the result of multiple interacting factors, with humans acting as one of several pressures. What distinguishes human influence, however, is its persistence. Natural predators typically regulate populations within a relatively stable equilibrium. Human hunting, combined with mobility and expanding territorial reach, introduces a different kind of pressure, one that follows populations across space rather than remaining fixed within a single ecosystem. As human groups expand into new regions, particularly those previously unoccupied or lightly populated, local ecosystems experience rapid adjustment. Large animals, unfamiliar with sustained human predation, often lack behavioral adaptations to avoid or mitigate this new threat. Over time, this can lead to sharp declines in population density. In some regions, the disappearance of large herbivores has cascading ecological effects. Vegetation patterns shift when grazing pressure is reduced. Predators that rely on large prey are forced to adapt, migrate, or decline. These cascading changes reshape entire ecosystems, although the full extent of these transformations is not immediately apparent within human perception. Within human societies themselves, the decline of large animals has significant consequences. These species often represent high-value resources, providing large quantities of meat, bone, and materials. As they become less available, human groups are forced to diversify their subsistence strategies. Smaller game, plant resources, and more varied ecological exploitation begin to play a greater role. This diversification leads to further refinement in tools and hunting strategies. Techniques become more specialized for smaller or more elusive prey. This, in turn, reinforces cognitive and behavioral flexibility, as groups must adapt to increasingly variable resource landscapes. Another important development during this period is the intensification of territorial awareness. As valuable resources become scarcer in certain regions, competition between groups increases. This does not immediately result in large-scale organized conflict, but it does lead to more frequent encounters, displacement, and avoidance behaviors. Human groups begin to develop more defined ranges of movement, often revisiting familiar territories while avoiding areas associated with other groups. This creates a patchwork of overlapping and shifting zones of influence across landscapes. These boundaries are not fixed, but they are increasingly recognized and respected, at least temporarily, due to practical necessity. The disappearance of megafauna is therefore not an isolated event, but part of a broader transformation in ecological relationships. Humans are not simply removing species from ecosystems. They are altering the structure of those ecosystems through repeated interaction, selective pressure, and spatial expansion. What remains particularly difficult to reconstruct is the subjective experience of this transition. Early humans would not have perceived extinction as a process. They would have experienced it as gradual absence, fewer encounters, longer searches, changing landscapes of opportunity. Only in hindsight, through accumulated evidence, does the scale of transformation become visible. And even then, uncertainty remains. Some regions show clearer patterns than others, and some extinctions may have occurred without significant human influence at all. The evidence remains incomplete, but the directional trend is consistent enough to suggest a meaningful relationship between human expansion and ecological contraction of large species. In this way, the world is beginning to lose some of its largest forms of life, not through a single catastrophic event, but through a prolonged and distributed shift in ecological pressure. And as these changes unfold, the role of humans within the system continues to move quietly towards something more influential than anything that came before. Territory, once an abstract consequence of movement, begins to take on a sharper meaning in the human experience of the world. In earlier times, space was defined primarily by access where food could be found, where water could be reached, where shelter could be maintained. But as populations grow and resources become more variable, space begins to acquire boundaries shaped not by geography alone, but by repeated human presence. These boundaries are not drawn in any formal sense. There are no markers carved into stone or lines etched into the land. Instead, they exist as patterns of avoidance and return. Certain valleys are revisited by one group and consistently avoided by another. Certain river corridors become preferred pathways, while others are treated as risky or uncertain. Over time, these repeated behaviors create invisible maps of occupation. The shift toward territorial behavior is gradual, but its consequences are significant. humans begin to treat space not just as resource distribution, but as shared or contested domains. This does not immediately lead to constant conflict, but it introduces a new layer of awareness into movement and decision-making. Encounters with other groups become more consequential, requiring assessment, caution, and sometimes retreat. Evidence for these shifts appears indirectly in archaeological patterns. Variations in tool styles between regions suggest localized cultural continuity. Differences in material use and technique imply that groups are not only moving through landscapes, but also maintaining distinct identities over time. These distinctions are subtle but persistent. As territorial awareness increases, mobility becomes more strategic. Movement is no longer purely reactive to environmental conditions. It is shaped by knowledge of where other groups are likely to be, where resources are shared or avoided, and where risks of encounter are higher. This adds complexity to what was once a more fluid pattern of seasonal migration. At the same time, environmental pressures continue to fluctuate. Climate instability forces repeated adjustments in resource availability, pushing groups into closer proximity in some regions while dispersing them in others. This dynamic interaction between ecological constraint and territorial behavior creates a constantly shifting human landscape. Encounters between groups, when they occur, vary widely in outcome. Some result in avoidance, others in temporary interaction, and some in direct conflict. There is no evidence of systematic warfare at this stage, but there are signs of increasing tension in certain regions where resources are concentrated or limited. These interactions likely contribute to the gradual formation of more defined group identities. Within groups, internal cohesion becomes increasingly important as external uncertainty grows. Cooperation is reinforced not only by shared survival needs, but also by the need to present a unified response in encounters with outsiders. This strengthens internal bonds and increases reliance on shared knowledge and coordinated action. Tool traditions continue to reflect these patterns. Regional variation in stone tool production becomes more pronounced over time. While basic functional requirements remain similar, stylistic and technical differences emerge, suggesting that knowledge transmission is becoming more localized. These differences are not merely practical, they reflect continuity of group identity across generations. Fire continues to play a central role in both survival and environmental interaction. Its use in hunting and land management reinforces territorial patterns, as certain areas become more frequently modified than others. Repeated burning near occupation zones alters vegetation structure, further distinguishing inhabited regions from surrounding landscapes. As these changes accumulate, the landscape begins to reflect a mosaic of human influence, not continuous or uniform, but patchy and regionally distinct. Some areas show frequent disturbance, others remain relatively untouched. This uneven distribution contributes to the complexity of ecological and social interactions. One of the more important developments during this period is the increasing importance of memory at the group level. Knowledge of safe routes, resource locations, seasonal cycles, and social interactions begins to form a shared cognitive framework that guides group behavior over long periods. This collective memory is not stored in any physical form, but it persists through repetition and teaching. This shared knowledge becomes a stabilizing force in an otherwise variable environment. It allows groups to maintain continuity across generations even as individuals come and go. In some cases, specific routes or resource areas remain in use for extended periods, maintained not by constant observation but by inherited practice. However, this stability also introduces rigidity. As certain territories become associated with specific groups, movement patterns begin to narrow in some regions, This can increase pressure on local resources, particularly when environmental conditions shift unexpectedly. The balance between flexibility and stability becomes an ongoing challenge. At a broader scale, human populations continue to expand into new regions. Migration remains a constant feature of this period, driven by both opportunity and necessity. Each new territory introduces unfamiliar ecological conditions, requiring rapid adaptation and knowledge acquisition. Over time, this contributes to increasing diversity in human behavior and ecological interaction. Despite these variations, the underlying trend remains consistent. Human presence is becoming more structured, more persistent, and more influential in shaping local environments. The combination of territorial behavior, cooperative organization, and ecological modification creates a feedback loop that reinforces human stability in many regions. Other species continue to adapt to these changes in different ways. Some avoid human-dominated areas, others adjust their behavior to coexist, and some are gradually displaced. These responses vary widely depending on ecological flexibility and reproductive capacity. What is becoming increasingly clear is that humans are no longer simply moving through landscapes. They are beginning to define them through repeated presence, shared knowledge, and accumulated impact. And once space becomes shaped by behavior rather than only by geography, the relationship between a species and its environment enters a fundamentally new phase. Encounters between human groups begin to carry a weight that was absent in earlier periods. What once might have been brief, cautious crossings in shared landscapes now unfolds under the shadow of accumulated experience, memory, and expectation. The presence of another group is no longer just a passing environmental fact. It is a variable that must be interpreted. At first, these encounters are still shaped by avoidance. Groups adjust their routes, delay movement, or shift direction to reduce direct contact. The priority remains survival, not confrontation. But as territories become more defined through repeated use, avoidance itself becomes less reliable. Paths converge, resources overlap. Seasonal pressures force proximity. When contact does occur, it is rarely uniform in outcome. Some encounters are marked by silence and mutual withdrawal, as if both sides recognize the cost of engagement. Others involve brief exchanges of observation assessment without commitment. In certain cases, however, tension escalates into direct conflict. There is no evidence of large-scale organized warfare at this stage, but there are indications of repeated violent interactions in specific regions where resources are concentrated or constrained. Archaeological findings support this pattern in indirect ways. Sites with clustered trauma on skeletal remains suggest interpersonal violence, though the scale and frequency vary widely across time and geography. These traces do not point to constant conflict, but rather to intermittent episodes embedded within broader patterns of coexistence and avoidance. What is significant is not the presence of violence itself, which exists in many animal species, but the context in which it occurs. Human conflict is increasingly shaped by group identity and territorial association, rather than immediate survival confrontation. This introduces a new dimension to ecological pressure, one that is social as much as environmental. Within groups, the awareness of other human groups begins to influence internal organization. Cohesion becomes more important as external encounters become less predictable. Shared identity is reinforced through repetition of collective action, shared knowledge, and coordinated responses to uncertainty. Even without formal leadership structures, patterns of influence begin to stabilize within groups based on experience and perceived reliability. At the same time, resource distribution continues to fluctuate under the influence of climate variability. Periods of abundance alternate with periods of scarcity, forcing repeated adjustments in movement and strategy. In times of scarcity, competition between groups intensifies, increasing the likelihood of territorial overlap and conflict. This interaction between environmental stress and social organization creates a feedback loop. Scarcity increases contact between groups, which increases tension, which in turn influences movement patterns and territorial behavior. Over time, this contributes to the gradual emergence of more structured boundaries, even if they remain informal and flexible. Tool traditions reflect these dynamics as well. Regional distinctions in stone technology become more pronounced, suggesting that knowledge transmission is becoming increasingly localized. While basic functional needs remain similar, stylistic and technical differences reinforce group identity and separation. These differences are not merely practical, they function as markers of continuity and belonging. Fire continues to play a dual role in this evolving landscape. It remains a tool for survival and environmental management, but it also contributes indirectly to territorial differentiation. Repeated use of fire in certain areas alters vegetation patterns in ways that distinguish occupied zones from surrounding regions. Over time, this reinforces the perception of space as structured and associated with specific groups. Mobility, once primarily dictated by environmental cycles, becomes increasingly shaped by social considerations. Movement decisions now account not only for resource availability, but also for the presence and likely behavior of other groups. This adds a layer of complexity to migration patterns, making them less predictable and more adaptive. Despite these changes, there is no evidence of centralized organization or coordinated large-scale warfare. Human societies remain small, flexible, and highly responsive to immediate conditions. Yet within this flexibility, a slow shift is occurring toward more structured forms of interaction between groups. One of the most important developments during this period is the increasing importance of reputation and memory across encounters. Groups begin to remember other groups not as individuals, but as collective entities associated with past outcomes. A previous encounter may influence future decisions to approach, avoid, or defend. This introduces continuity into intergroup relations. Over time, this continuity begins to shape the broader landscape of human interaction. Certain regions become associated with higher risk of conflict, while others function as neutral zones or shared corridors. These patterns are not fixed, but they persist long enough to influence long-term movement and settlement behavior. As human populations expand into new areas, these dynamics repeat across different environments. The same structural patterns, avoidance, occasional contact, conflict under pressure, and gradual differentiation emerge independently, suggesting that these behaviors are not isolated developments but systemic responses to ecological and social conditions. Other species continue to interact with this evolving human landscape, but increasingly on terms shaped by human presence. Predators adjust their hunting ranges. Herbivores modify migration routes. Some species decline locally, while others adapt to human-modified environments. The ecological system remains functional, but its structure is becoming more complex and increasingly influenced by a single expanding factor. Within this unfolding complexity, humans are beginning to operate at multiple scales: simultaneously immediate survival, group coordination, intergroup awareness, and environmental modification. These layers interact continuously, reinforcing one another and increasing the overall impact of human presence. And once interaction extends beyond environment into sustained relationships between groups, the foundation is laid not only for territorial awareness, but for the earliest forms of structured competition. the land does not change its rules, but the pressure upon those rules begins to accumulate from every direction at once. Climate fluctuations continue to reshape ecosystems in cycles that no human group can control, yet every group must respond to. A colder stretch compresses habitable zones toward more stable refuges. A warmer phase expands them outward, scattering resources across wider and less predictable terrain. In both directions, movement becomes unavoidable. It is within these oscillations that migration takes on a new character. Earlier movements were primarily local adjustments, short shifts in response to immediate scarcity or seasonal opportunity. Now, entire sequences of relocation begin to stretch across generations. A group may no longer return to a familiar valley for decades, or ever. Memory becomes less about place and more about direction, pattern, and survival logic. As groups move into unfamiliar environments, they encounter conditions that do not align with their inherited knowledge. New predators, different vegetation cycles, altered water rhythms, and unfamiliar terrain features force rapid adaptation. In some cases, survival depends on improvisation that is not supported by prior experience. In others, failure to adapt results in disappearance from the local landscape entirely. These pressures do not act uniformly. Some regions provide refuge with stable resources, allowing groups to remain in place for longer periods. Others become transitional corridors where movement is constant and settlement is brief. Over time, this creates a layered geography of human-presence stable cores, shifting edges, and vast zones of intermittent occupation. Resource pressure intensifies this instability. As populations expand in favorable regions, local availability begins to fluctuate more sharply, not necessarily due to depletion alone, but due to increased competition and overlapping usage patterns. Even in the absence of large-scale environmental collapse, density alone can alter access and distribution. It is under these conditions that resource pressure begins to intersect more sharply with intergroup dynamics. Encounters between groups become more frequent not only because of territorial overlap, but because environmental stress forces convergence on remaining viable zones. What once were rare crossings now become recurring points of tension. Within this context, conflict does not emerge as a singular invention, but as a repeated outcome under pressure. Small-scale confrontations, defensive posturing, and strategic avoidance all become part of a broader adaptive repertoire. Groups begin to assess not only the environment, but the likely behavior of other groups under similar conditions. This introduces a new form of strategic awareness. Decisions are no longer based solely on immediate survival variables, but also on anticipated reactions of others. Movement, resource gathering, and settlement choices begin to incorporate social prediction, even in its most basic form. This marks an expansion in cognitive load at the group level. At the same time, internal organization becomes more critical. As external uncertainty increases, coordination within groups must become more reliable. Shared understanding of signals, routes, and responses reduces the cost of unpredictability. Individuals who contribute to this stability gain influence through demonstrated reliability rather than formal authority. Archaeological patterns from this period show increasing complexity in site usage. Some locations appear to be revisited repeatedly over long spans of time, suggesting the maintenance of long-term movement circuits. Others show brief, intense occupation followed by abandonment, indicating flexible responses to shifting environmental and social conditions. Tool traditions continue to diversify in parallel. Regional differences become more pronounced. reflecting both adaptation to local conditions and the strengthening of group-specific knowledge systems. These variations are not random. They follow consistent patterns that suggest knowledge is being preserved and transmitted within bounded social networks. Fire use remains a central adaptive tool, but its environmental consequences become more visible at larger scales. In regions of repeated burning, vegetation cycles begin to shift more permanently. Some ecosystems transition toward fire-adapted states, while others experience gradual reduction in biodiversity due to repeated disturbance. These changes are slow but cumulative. One of the most significant developments during this period is the increasing integration of memory and environment. Landscapes are no longer experienced only as physical spaces, but as repositories of shared history. Certain locations become associated with past success, failure, conflict, or scarcity. This layering of memory onto geography creates a more complex cognitive map of survival. As migration expands across continents, these cognitive maps become increasingly fragmented and localized. Groups separated by distance or environmental barriers develop distinct knowledge systems shaped by different ecological conditions. Over time, this contributes to increasing diversity in human adaptation strategies. Despite this diversification, underlying behavioral patterns remain consistent. Humans continue to rely on cooperation, memory, tool use, and environmental modification. What changes is the scale and configuration of these elements, not their fundamental presence. Other species continue to respond to these shifts, but increasingly within a landscape that includes persistent human activity. Some adapt by avoiding human presence entirely, others by exploiting modified environments, and others by declining under sustained pressure. The ecological system remains intact, but its internal relationships are becoming more complex and less predictable. Within this evolving structure, humans are no longer simply reacting to environmental change. They are now responding simultaneously to climate, resources, terrain, and the behavior of other human groups. This multi-layered responsiveness increases cognitive and social complexity in ways that reinforce adaptability, but also increase tension. And once survival depends on navigating not just nature, but the interactions of multiple human systems across unstable landscapes, the conditions begin to emerge for more structured forms of organization and sustained competition. At some point within this long stretch of prehistory, a subtle but decisive shift begins to appear in the structure of human conflict. What was once intermittent, situational, and largely reactive starts to show signs of repetition, pattern, and anticipation. Encounters between groups no longer unfold as isolated events. They begin to resemble sequences, shaped by prior experience and expected outcomes. This does not mean that warfare exists in any fully developed form. There are no permanent armies, no centralized command structures, no sustained campaigns spanning vast territories. But there are repeated confrontations that suggest something new is forming beneath the surface conflict that is beginning to organize itself. In regions where resources are concentrated or seasonal scarcity is severe, encounters between groups become more frequent and more consequential. Avoidance is still common, but it becomes less reliable as populations move into overlapping ranges. When contact occurs, the outcome is increasingly influenced by prior memory. A group that has experienced hostility from another may respond more defensively in the future. Likewise, a group that has successfully asserted control over a resource zone may be more likely to defend it again. Over time, this produces a form of behavioral continuity. Conflict is no longer purely situational, it is partially shaped by history. Even without formal record keeping, memory at the group level begins to function as a guide for future interaction. Past encounters influence present decisions, and present decisions influence future expectations. This is one of the earliest foundations of organized warfare, not as a system, but as a pattern of repeated strategic behavior emerging under pressure. At the same time, internal organization within groups continues to strengthen. Coordination during high-risk situations requires more reliable communication and faster decision-making. Individuals who consistently contribute to group survival in these contexts gain increasing influence. This influence is not institutional, but situational and reinforced through repeated success. What is emerging is not hierarchy in a rigid sense, but a tendency towards structured responsiveness. Certain individuals become focal points during conflict or uncertainty, guiding group behavior through experience rather than formal authority. Over time, these roles may stabilize, but at this stage they remain fluid and context-dependent. Environmental pressure continues to act as the underlying driver of these developments. Climate variability, resource scarcity, and population movement all contribute to increased contact and competition. In some regions, extended periods of instability force repeated cycles of displacement and resettlement. In others, relatively stable environments allow longer continuity of occupation, which can intensify local competition as populations grow. Within this dynamic, tools and technology begin to play a more pronounced role in conflict outcomes. Spears, projectiles, and cutting implements extend the range and effectiveness of human action. Fire continues to be used strategically in some contexts, not only for survival but for shaping movement and visibility during encounters. These technologies do not transform conflict into something entirely new, but they increase its efficiency and potential scale. Archaeological evidence from this period occasionally shows clustered trauma patterns and abrupt site abandonment, suggesting episodes of intensified violence followed by rapid relocation. While these patterns are not universal, they appear in enough regions to indicate that conflict is becoming a more significant factor in shaping human movement and settlement. At the same time, differentiation between groups becomes more pronounced. Regional variations in tool production, resource use, and settlement patterns reflect increasingly distinct cultural trajectories. These differences are reinforced by limited interaction and repeated cycles of conflict or avoidance. Identity, in this sense, begins to emerge not as a conscious concept, but as a consequence of repeated separation and internal cohesion. This growing differentiation has important ecological implications. As groups become more territorially defined and socially cohesive, their impact on specific landscapes becomes more consistent and sustained. Certain areas experience repeated cycles of occupation and modification, while others remain relatively untouched. The result is an increasingly heterogeneous human footprint across the environment. One of the most significant developments during this stage is the growing importance of anticipation in conflict situations. Groups begin to act not only based on immediate threat, but based on expected behavior of others. This requires inference, memory, and projection. Even in its simplest form, this represents a major cognitive expansion in how humans navigate social landscapes. This anticipatory behavior gradually shifts the nature of conflict from purely reactive encounters to partially strategic interactions. Even without formal planning systems, repeated experience allows groups to recognize patterns and adjust behavior accordingly. This does not eliminate unpredictability, but it reduces it enough to influence outcomes over time. Despite these developments, there is still no evidence of large-scale coordinated warfare in the modern sense. Human groups remain small, mobile, and highly sensitive to environmental constraints. Conflict is intermittent, localized, and deeply tied to survival conditions rather than expansionist goals. Yet the structural components of more organized systems are beginning to assemble. Repetition, memory, coordination, anticipation, and resource competition are all converging under environmental pressure. These elements do not yet form a unified system, but they increasingly interact in ways that reinforce one another. Other species continue to exist within this evolving landscape, but their interactions with humans are increasingly shaped by avoidance, displacement, or adaptation. Human presence is no longer a peripheral factor. It is becoming one of the recurring forces that structures ecological and social relationships alike. And once conflict begins to carry memory, pattern, and anticipation, it stops being an isolated reaction and starts becoming part of a developing system of structured competition. Within human groups, something quietly shifts in the way stability is maintained. It is no longer enough for survival to rely purely on shared participation and spontaneous coordination. As environments grow more unpredictable and intergroup encounters more consequential, certain patterns of influence begin to persist beyond individual moments of necessity. At first, this is barely distinguishable from ordinary experience. In times of danger, some individuals naturally take on guiding roles due to their familiarity with terrain, hunting conditions, or past encounters. Others contribute through physical capability or accumulated knowledge. What begins to emerge is not formal authority, but repeated recognition of reliability under pressure. Over time, these repeated recognitions begin to cluster around certain individuals. Their decisions are more likely to be followed during uncertain situations. Their assessments of risk are more likely to be trusted. Their presence becomes increasingly associated with successful outcomes. This is not enforced structure, but emergent hierarchy shaped by experience. At the same time, the growing complexity of survival conditions reinforces the need for coordination. Environmental instability, resource fluctuations, and intergroup competition all increase the cost of disorganization. Groups that can respond quickly and cohesively to changing conditions are more likely to survive extended periods of uncertainty. This reinforces the importance of individuals who can reduce uncertainty within the group. In practical terms, these individuals begin to function as stabilizing points during decision-making. Their influence is situational but increasingly consistent. Over long periods, this consistency creates the foundation for more structured leadership roles. Archaeological evidence does not preserve social roles directly, but indirect indicators suggest increasing differentiation in group dynamics. Certain individuals appear more frequently in contexts associated with hunting success, tool production, or conflict-related injuries. While interpretation remains cautious, these patterns suggest that experience and capability are becoming unevenly distributed within groups. At the same time, knowledge transmission becomes more critical. As groups expand into new territories or face changing environmental conditions, the ability to pass down effective strategies becomes essential for continuity. This includes knowledge of animal behavior, seasonal cycles, resource locations, and effective tool use. This transmission is still largely observational and experiential, but its reliability increases over time. Repeated teaching and imitation reduce loss of information between generations. As a result, groups become more stable across time, even as individuals come and go. Fire continues to play a central role in reinforcing this stability. Beyond its practical uses, it creates a shared focal point around which group activity is organized. Nighttime gatherings around controlled fire extend communication and social interaction, reinforcing cohesion and shared awareness. In regions where fire use is consistent, its influence extends into environmental structure as well. Repeated burning continues to shape vegetation patterns, creating landscapes that are increasingly associated with human presence. These altered environments, in turn, influence movement patterns of both humans and animals, reinforcing the feedback loop between behavior and ecology. Meanwhile, increasing environmental variability continues to challenge group stability. Droughts, temperature shifts, and resource fluctuations force repeated adaptation. In some cases, groups that cannot maintain internal coordination under stress fragment or relocate. In others, strong internal cohesion allows continued survival despite external instability. This dynamic increases the importance of internal structure. Even without formal institutions, groups begin to exhibit more stable patterns of influence and coordination. These patterns are not fixed, but they persist long enough to influence long-term survival outcomes. Tool production also reflects this increasing internal differentiation. Certain individuals or subgroups develop higher proficiency in creating and maintaining tools. These skills become valuable not only for individual survival, but for group effectiveness. Over time, this contributes to the emergence of expertise as a recognizable feature of social organization. As specialization increases, interdependence within groups becomes more pronounced. Survival is no longer evenly distributed across identical roles. Instead, it depends on a combination of complementary abilities that must function together under pressure. This increases both efficiency and vulnerability, as disruption in one area can affect the entire group. Across different regions, these patterns emerge independently, suggesting that they are not isolated cultural developments but responses to shared structural pressures. Wherever environmental instability and resource competition intensify, similar forms of differentiation and coordination begin to appear. At the same time, intergroup dynamics continue to influence internal organization. The need to respond to external threats reinforces cohesion and encourages more consistent internal alignment. Groups that fail to maintain unity during encounters with others are less likely to retain territory or resources. Gradually, the combination of environmental pressure, intergroup competition, and internal coordination leads to more structured forms of social organization. These are not yet formal institutions, but they represent a shift toward persistent roles and expectations within groups. What is becoming visible is a gradual consolidation of influence, where certain individuals or patterns of behavior consistently shape group outcomes over time. This does not eliminate flexibility, but it introduces a stabilizing structure within otherwise fluid social systems. At the ecological level, humans are now consistently shaping their environment through repeated patterns of behavior. At the social level, they are beginning to organize themselves in ways that enhance coordination and survival under complexity. These two processes reinforce each other, creating a feedback loop between environment and society. And once stability depends not only on cooperation but on consistent patterns of influence within groups, the foundations for more formalized structures of organization begin to take shape. By now, human presence is no longer a scattered anomaly across the planet's surface. It has become a persistent shaping force embedded in the behavior of ecosystems themselves. The most important change is not simply that humans exist in more places, but that the conditions of survival in many regions are now partially defined by human activity. In earlier periods, humans adapted to landscapes. In this stage, landscapes begin to adapt to humans as well, not in a conscious or directed sense, but through accumulated pressure, repeated hunting, repeated burning, repeated movement patterns, and repeated settlement cycles begin to produce long-term structural changes in vegetation, animal distribution, and ecological balance. Forests near frequently used routes become thinner and more open over time. Grasslands expand in areas where fire is regularly present. Animal populations adjust migration timing and spatial behavior in response to recurring disturbance. These changes are uneven, but they are persistent. The environment is no longer a fixed backdrop. It is becoming a responsive system influenced by one species' behavior. Within this shifting ecological framework, humans transition from being participants in food webs to becoming consistent modifiers of them. This does not mean complete control. Instead, it means that multiple ecological outcomes are now partially dependent on human presence or absence in a given region. One of the most significant developments during this stage is the increasing predictability of human impact itself, where humans repeatedly occupy or traverse certain landscapes. Ecological responses begin to stabilize into recognizable patterns. Some species decline locally, others thrive in disturbed environments, and others shift their behavior to coexist with human presence. Over time, these responses become part of a new ecological baseline. At the same time, human groups continue to expand into new regions, carrying with them established patterns of tool use, fire management, cooperative hunting, and territorial awareness. Each new environment is not simply inhabited, but gradually reshaped through repeated interaction. Even without centralized planning, these patterns propagate across vast geographic scales. Internally, human social organization continues to evolve under the pressure of complexity. Coordination within groups becomes more refined, especially in contexts of resource acquisition and environmental uncertainty. Roles based on experience, skill, and reliability become increasingly stable over time. While still flexible, these roles begin to influence long-term group structure more consistently than in earlier periods. This does not create rigid hierarchy in a modern sense, but it does introduce persistent asymmetry in influence. Certain individuals or patterns of behavior become more consistently associated with successful outcomes. As a result, their guidance carries greater weight during decision-making processes, particularly in high-risk situations. Knowledge transmission becomes even more critical under these conditions. Survival now depends not only on immediate adaptation, but on the continuity of accumulated experience across generations. Techniques for tool production, fire management, movement strategies, and ecological interpretation become increasingly refined and reliably passed down. Fire, in particular, continues to expand its influence beyond immediate survival needs. In regions of frequent use, it reshapes entire ecological cycles over long periods. Vegetation patterns adjust to repeated disturbance regimes. Animal behavior shifts in response to altered visibility and habitat structure. Even soil composition and regeneration cycles begin to reflect recurring human presence. These environmental transformations, while gradual, contribute to a feedback loop. Altered landscapes influence human behavior, which in turn reinforces those alterations. This loop gradually strengthens the connection between human activity and ecological structure. At the same time, intergroup dynamics continue to evolve. Encounters between groups are now shaped by accumulated memory, territorial awareness, and repeated experience. Certain regions become known for higher risk or greater resource value based on long-term patterns of interaction. These perceptions influence movement decisions and conflict likelihood. While large-scale organized warfare still does not exist, the underlying components of structured conflict are now more clearly present. Repetition, memory, anticipation, coordination, and resource pressure all interact in increasingly complex ways. Conflict is no longer purely spontaneous. It is increasingly shaped by expectation and precedent. Within groups, internal cohesion remains essential for survival. Environmental instability continues to force adaptation, while external pressures require coordinated responses. Groups that fail to maintain internal alignment during periods of stress are less likely to persist across generations. As a result, behavioral consistency within groups becomes more important. Shared understanding of movement patterns, resource use, and response strategies increases the likelihood of successful adaptation. Over time, this reinforces stable internal structures of influence and coordination. By this stage, humans are operating simultaneously across multiple layers of interaction. They are responding to immediate environmental conditions, navigating intergroup relationships, maintaining internal cohesion, and modifying ecosystems through repeated behavior. These layers are no longer separate, they are deeply interconnected. What emerges from this is not a single moment of dominance, but a gradual convergence of systems. Environmental feedback, social organization, technological development, and cognitive expansion all begin to reinforce one another. And once these systems begin to lock together in persistent feedback loops, the role of humans within the planet's structure shifts from influence to something far more enduring and self-reinforcing. There is no clear moment in prehistory where the world announces that a threshold has been crossed. No visible boundary forms in the soil. No sudden rupture appears in the climate record. No single species rises and declares dominance. Instead, what unfolds is a long convergence, built from countless small actions that begin to reinforce each other across time. Human activity, once local and temporary, has by now become persistent across vast regions. The repetition of movement, fire use, hunting, settlement, and intergroup interaction has created patterns that no longer dissipate quickly. Each action leaves behind a trace that influences the next, and those traces accumulate into structure. Ecosystems that once operated under relatively stable predator-prey dynamics are now continuously shaped by human presence. In some regions, large animals have already disappeared or become rare. In others, populations persist but under altered behavior, shifting migration routes and avoiding areas of repeated disturbance. Plant communities reorganize around cycles of burning and regrowth influenced by human activity. Even soil and landscape patterns begin to reflect long-term occupation. At the same time, human groups are no longer simply adapting to these environments, they're actively co-evolving with them. Fire, tools, mobility, and cooperative behavior are no longer separate survival strategies. They are interconnected systems that reinforce one another. Fire reshapes landscapes, which influences animal movement, which alters hunting strategies, which feeds back into group organization and settlement patterns. Internally, human societies have developed more stable forms of coordination, not formal institutions, but persistent structures of influence, knowledge transmission, and behavioral expectation. Certain individuals consistently guide decisions in critical moments due to experience and demonstrated reliability. Knowledge of environment, timing, and strategy is no longer isolated within individuals, but distributed across networks of memory and practice. This distribution of knowledge allows human groups to persist across environmental instability. Even when individuals are lost, the system retains enough continuity to reconstruct behavior. This is one of the key transitions that separates earlier stages of human existence from what comes next. Survival is no longer dependent solely on individual memory, but on collective continuity. Intergroup dynamics have also stabilized into recognizable patterns. Encounters between groups are shaped by memory, territorial awareness, and repeated interaction. Conflict remains localized and intermittent, but it now follows predictable conditions tied to resource pressure and environmental constraint. Avoidance, negotiation, and confrontation exist as recurring responses rather than isolated reactions. Across continents, these patterns repeat independently. Wherever humans expand into new environments, the same structural tendencies emerge: cooperation within groups, differentiation between groups, ecological modification through repeated behavior, and increasing reliance on accumulated knowledge. This convergence suggests that these developments are not cultural accidents, but systemic outcomes of cognition interacting with environmental pressure. By this stage, humans are no longer simply one species among many within ecological systems. They have become a distributed influence operating across multiple layers of those systems simultaneously. Their presence affects not only immediate surroundings, but long-term ecological trajectories. Yet even this does not occur as a sudden takeover. There is no final moment where control is achieved. Instead, there is gradual locking together of feedback loops. Environmental change alters human behavior. Human behavior alters environments. Social structures stabilize those behaviors, and cognition enables increasingly complex anticipation of outcomes. This self-reinforcing cycle marks the true turning point. Not domination through force, but persistence through interdependence between biology, behavior, and environment. From this point onward, reversal becomes increasingly unlikely. Not because humans are invulnerable, but because their influence is now embedded within the systems they depend on. They are no longer external actors acting upon nature. They are part of the mechanism through which nature is continuously reshaped. The planet remains vast, ancient, and indifferent. Ice still advances and retreats. Continents still shift over geological time. Species will still emerge and disappear. But within the thin, accelerating layer of human activity, a new kind of stability has formed, one built not on equilibrium, but on continuous transformation driven by accumulated impact. And in that transformation lies the defining realization of this entire sequence. Humanity did not become the most dangerous species through a single act, invention, or a moment of conquest. It became so through accumulation, connection, and reinforcement until its presence was no longer a disturbance within the world, but a system intertwined with it. The world before this point did not end abruptly. It dissolved gradually into something new as influence became structure, and structure became irreversible. And what remains afterward is not a break in history, but a different kind of history entirely, one shaped continuously by the presence of a species that learned, step by step, how to turn survival into transformation,